ECON 345, welcome to another fantastic episode of Working with Taxes. So today we're going through optimal taxation and tax inefficiencies. This is actually one of my favorite lectures, so it should be a lot of fun. All right, screen one, put me over here. Yeah, let's get down to business. Tax inefficiencies and implications for optimal taxation. I forgot to change the title a little bit. So let me start this off by setting the mood. Let's go back to a quote by Arnold Harberger. He's one of the original people who developed the idea of taxation and figuring out how we can get optimal taxation. He had said, with his experiences looking at different motorcycles in Indonesia, cars are taxed far more heavily than motorcycles in Indonesia. And this is what he said about his experience. Three-wheeled cycles were converted by artful additions into virtual buses, or at least taxis. Sometimes a single bench was added with the passenger looking backwards. Other times the cycle was stretched at the back with two benches going down each side, and maybe even with a little extra running board cutting laterally across the rear. I must say I was truly astounded when I saw my first 8-passenger motorcycle. So this kind of just gives an example of what happens when you tax things. Inefficiencies can happen. In this case, Indonesia had taxed so heavily their car market that people were making very unsafe and hazardous decisions with their motorcycles by having them converted into passenger type things, right? So markets don't take taxes lying down. If you add in a tax, people are creative and they don't like spending money. They most of the time will find a way around it at one level or another. Now, if they're morally going to do it, maybe not, but they're going to be creative and find their way around it. It's human instinct, right, to avoid cost. So if there is some action the market participants can undertake to try to minimize their taxation, whether it's putting someone extra on their motorcycle or coming up with a unique tax credit to be able to try to reduce their tax bill, people are going to do that. So there's this idea between taxation and economic efficiency. Most of the time, we have our nice little supply and demand graph. We assume we kind of get to the middle and that we get to this sort of equilibrium in an unregulated space. Usually, for most things, the market produces efficient outcomes. Taxes are a purposeful interference that we're putting into the market, and it reduces efficiency. I mean, that's just true. We're making it more costly for either the supplier or for the person who's consuming the good, and it's going to shift that supply and demand curve and get us from our efficient equilibrium of where we would be in society. People tend to substitute away from tax products. They use less efficient alternatives. For example, 8-person motorcycles in Indonesia. So in some taxes have much larger efficiency costs than other sorts of taxes. So understanding why, or what the true effects on economic efficiency is, or if there's certain types of taxes that have much larger effects on the total surplus of society relative to other taxes, that's going to matter to us as, our delightful economists, as we're trying to figure out how this world works. It's a way that we can kind of think through this entire system and how they work together. So let's think a little bit more about this taxes and economic efficiency. Actually, let's do it before we get to the taxes. So we know in our exploration of externalities that we tend to operate, or we would like to ideally operate, at the point where social marginal benefit equals social marginal cost. Now, if there's an externality, then that means that there is a mismatch in between what private marginal benefit and social marginal benefit is, or between private marginal cost and social marginal cost. And that means that we have some sort of externality that's happening, whether it be good, whether it be bad. But let's say that society is not really polluting much in this case. We're going to say that this is a very efficient one where we already kind of think about the societal norms. Then in our unregulated markets, our price would be equal to that social marginal benefit, where it equals the social marginal cost. Now, regulated markets means that we are introducing a tax or a subsidy to the system, or maybe even a quota, which is a certain limit on the amount of something that we're producing. Taxes, when we introduce taxes to the system, drive a wedge between social marginal benefit and social marginal cost. It makes it so that there's an additional cost to one side or the other and kind of moves us from that efficient point that we're used to being at. It prevents mutually beneficial trades from occurring because ones that were right on the cusp, the ones that were very, very close to not being able to be afforded or not coming together, they're going to be the ones that are more likely to shift away, or the more price sensitive people are more likely to shift away. which means that we have some sort of foregone surplus, right? We call this our deadweight loss. It's the idea that we're going to have a reduction in the consumer and producer surplus. And this size of the deadweight loss really depends on the elasticity of the curves. So I'm going to take you all the way back. I'm going to take you nice and back to, our early econ days and take you through what these taxes and subsidies look like on graphs. So let's put up paint. Yeah. All right. So first I'm going to give you just a normal graph, right? So that we understand again where consumer and producer surplus is, because I'm sure it's been a little bit of time since you've seen this. All right, so we know that we have our price, we have our quantity, we have our downward sloping demand curve, and our upward sloping supply curve. All right, so we know that we have our equilibrium right here. This is the one where we have no taxes introduced to the system, and we're going to assume that this is actually the social marginal benefit because we don't have any externalities in the system, and we're going to assume that this is the social marginal cost because there's no externalities in this system. All right, and we're operating right here where we have some sort of equilibrium quantity, let's call this QE, and we have some sort of equilibrium price, PE. And I'm sorry if this feels like I'm telling you about things that I know you've studied a million times, but I'm kind of giving us a refresher of this early material so that we can all be on the same page. Now remember, this social marginal benefit, or the benefit that society gets from something, that's pretty similar to what they're willing to pay for it, right? So it could be that maybe, let's say this equilibrium price, because it's just easier to work with numbers. Let's say that the equilibrium price is $5 and we sell 100 gadgets when we have that $5. Okay, well, then that means that there would have been someone who was willing to pay $5.25 who really paid $5. That means they get some consumer surplus. They're really happy because they would have been willing to pay more than that, but they got a good deal. That means that there might have also been someone who really, really wanted this good and was willing to pay $10 for it, and yet they only paid $5. That's a good deal. If I was willing to pay 10 and you only charge me 5, I get $5 of surplus. I get $5 of happiness. The collection of all of these points right here within this triangle, all the good deals that people are getting, all that feeling of, yeah, that's awesome. I would have been willing to pay more than that because our willingness to pay is above the price. We call this consumer surplus. On the other side, we have producer surplus. Producer surplus is the difference in between what people are willing to accept and what the price is, right? So there might be one company who they were willing to sell off this gadget for $4.75, but they end up getting $5 in the market. Well, that's good. They get some profit. They're getting a price that's actually above what their marginal cost is, right? Because their marginal cost is kind of reflective of the bare minimum that someone's willing to accept. It's how much it costs me to make something. So that means that they actually get a surplus. They're pretty happy. That's a price above that. There might have been someone who could make this gadget for really, really cheap. Maybe it costs them $1 and they're really making $5 in the market. Well, that's $4 worth of surplus that they're getting, of good deal energy, right? So with this triangle created right here in the bottom part, we call this the producer surplus. Now, what we've learned so far in this class is that when we shift one of these lines, there might be some sort of inefficiency created, which might be represented by something that we call deadweight loss. Right? It's this triangle of trades that would have happened that are no longer happening, or in some cases, when we're looking at subsidies, trades that we want to happen that are not happening. So let's say in this one, this particular line, maybe we have a difference of a tax. A tax is a vertical difference in between two lines, right? So maybe this is our social marginal cost plus a tax that we put into the system. Now, at first, we had the, right here, unregulated equilibrium. And we see at that unregulated equilibrium, if when we were right here, we did not have this deadweight loss. But then all of a sudden, we're putting in a tax. We're introducing a regulation. When we put in a regulation, we have a regulated market. And in this, we see that a deadweight loss is created. Now, this is a little different from what we saw in externalities, right? Because in externalities, the unregulated market was the inefficient one, while the regulated market was when we were trying to correct for the externality to get us back to the social marginal benefit equals social marginal cost. Here, our unregulated market is where social marginal benefit already equals social marginal cost, because we are, so far, here. No externality. Please remember that for the next like 30 minutes. We're going to get into the case of what happens when there's an externality and a tax, but in all the stuff that I'm talking about at the beginning, we're going to assume there's no externality so that this unregulated market's actually efficient. Okay, you know where we are? Then let's go through our 4 different cases. So I'm just going to give you all 4 of the charts that you might possibly have. So let's say, all right, there we go. We're going to have, let's break this up. Let's say that we are going to have this as the subsidies, because it's just good to know about that. We're going to have these as the taxes, or the tax side. Okay, and then we're going to have it, let's do it in green, on the producers, and then on the consumers. All right, let's look at our 4 different graphs. So we got our price, our quantity, our downward sloping demand curve, and our upward sloping supply curve. Let's just, nope. Ha-ha! Your professor's still smart and youthful. Look at me, mastering the technology like one of the youths. Ah, it's great. Boom. All right, so let's say that we have 4 different graphs that are going to represent these things. This top left is going to be when we put a tax on the producers. Okay, when we put a tax on something, we shift it to the left, right? So let's say that this is our demand and supply. We can also think about this as our, you know, marginal social benefit and marginal social cost. Right here is our unregulated market where we have, you know, some amount of widgets being produced with no deadweight loss. Okay, what happens when we introduce a tax? So we're now going to have supply plus a tax. Boom, this line right here. Okay, let's think about what happens. Step 1, when I give you these, is you should take our new equilibrium, this new equilibrium, draw a line down to our original line. Did a triangle form? If yes, that is your new deadweight loss. Congratulations. So let's see. Our Q, let's call this QU, our quantity in the unregulated market, versus our quantity in the regulated market when we introduce a tax, we actually lose some trades. And that's because the relative price, so let's see, price unregulated, price regulated, has gone up. Well, what happens when price goes up? You sell less of something, right? So now we have deadweight loss that's occurring in this system. There's loss to the surplus. There's consumers who aren't getting their good deals. There's producers who aren't getting their good deals, and that's bad. All right, let's do a couple more. Let's say that we're continuing on the producer side, or no, let's keep up with taxes first. Okay, let's do taxes. Let's say that we're going to put the tax on the consumers. This is someone at the register, right? So here we put a tax on them. D plus tax. All right, what was the first step that I told you to do? It was go to your new equilibrium. Draw a line to your old line. Look, has a triangle been formed? Yes, it has. We see in this one that we also see a deadweight loss. Why is that? Because prices have gone up and quantity has gone down. We see this all the time, whether you put the tax on the consumer or the producer side. And remember what we learned last time about tax incidence, it doesn't really matter which side of the market you put it on. What does matter on who bears the burden of a tax is the slope of that line, right? It's the inelastic or elastic features of supply and demand. Now, I'm just showing you subsidies because I like subsidies. We're going to figure this out. All right, let's say that we put in a subsidy. Now, subsidies are opposite of taxes. Oops, where's the thing? There we go. Taxes, I'm making something more expensive, right? I'm saying that they have to pay the government, i.e. me, the government, every time they sell something. Subsidies, on the other hand, are, every time you sell something, you know, I'd really like more of these out there in the world, so I'm going to give you money. every time you make one of these or sell them. Well, then that kind of reduces the cost of production, right? So let's say that we do this to the producer side. Oops, nope, that was, maybe I'm not the master of technology. Okay. Yeah, so let's say we have supply plus a subsidy. Okay, all right, what's step number one? Step number one, take your new equilibrium, draw a line to old equilibrium. Boom. Has a triangle been formed? Yes, it has. Because we were originally efficient, we are no longer efficient. Because notice, we have this new deadweight loss. But this deadweight loss is a little different. Let's figure out why. That's because our quantity in our unregulated market is less than our quantity in our regulated markets. We're actually going to end up increasing the quantity. Let's also see what happens to price. Our price in our unregulated market is greater than the price in our regulated market. The price goes down and the quantity goes up. Okay, well, maybe that's a subsidy because we want more of something to happen. That's the idea of like subsidizing vaccines or children's health. It's things that you typically want more of, right? The thing is, there are some inefficiencies that are created in this line. What it is these are people who are now getting whatever that good is that may not have necessarily gotten the good beforehand. All right, let's put the subsidy on demand. So D plus subsidy. Boom. All right. Step one, new equilibrium. Step two, dotted line. Step three, look for triangle. Whoa, hey, look, there's a triangle. We've seen it. This is the triangle. All right, deadweight loss has occurred in this one. Similar things have happened, right? Our quantity has gone up between our unregulated and regulated market, and our prices have gone down. That's because subsidies are used to incentivize things. The thing is, deadweight loss still technically occurs. These are people who are now getting this good who may not have otherwise gotten this good. It's also people selling the good that may not have otherwise sold the good. Ha! All right, these are kind of your 4 different situations that we might see when we're thinking about deadweight loss, right? So there are taxes, there are subsidies, there are lots of things happening within our system. And what really, really, really matters to the size of the deadweight loss is if they're inelastic or not. So remember, when they're inelastic, one person takes the entirety of the tax and the same amount is bought and sold. Is there any deadweight loss if the same amount is bought and sold? Well, no, not necessarily, right? Let's think about what an inelastic, what is this one? What an inelastic demand versus an elastic demand might look like. On the left side of the screen, we see a relatively inelastic demand. This means that this person, whether you jack up the price by a lot, they're probably still going to buy it. Now, if it's a lot, they may not, but they're probably still going to buy it. So we see if we introduce a tax to this relatively inelastic good, let's say it's gasoline, because people will drive about the same amount if gas is $2 or $4. So let's say it's gasoline and we put a 30-cent tax on gasoline. Well, there's a very small reduction in consumption. See, this difference is on the Q's on the bottom, very small difference in the amount consumed, even though there's a large price jump. Now, what does that mean? Well, look, this deadweight loss triangle that's been created, it's really small. And it's because a similar quantity is still sold. It's not that we put in a tax and lots of people stop doing it. This is why we tend to want to tax more inelastic goods, right? If we're wanting to be efficient, that means we're wanting to minimize deadweight loss. If we want to minimize deadweight loss, then if we're introducing a tax to the system, it needs to be on an inelastic good. This is why we have sin taxes, because they're pretty decent sources of revenue, right? You put them on alcohol, cigarettes, other things like that. You know that people are still going to buy about the same amount, so you have a predictable revenue source. Inelastic demand. Now let's say it's more an elastic demand. Let's say this is I don't know, oranges. If I start taxing oranges by a lot, if you're demanding oranges, you're gonna be like, no thank you, I'm not paying a crazy tax on oranges, I'm just gonna go eat apples or blueberries or something. So what happens in this case, when it's a relatively elastic demand, you're very willing to walk away relative to price changes. Well, then if we introduce a tax on the supplier, what do we see happen? Well, we see that the price doesn't change by a lot because you can't change the price a lot on these people. They're really very willing to run away, but a much larger deadweight loss triangle has been created. That's pretty interesting. So notice that deadweight loss is much larger when we're starting to look at more elastic goods. So elasticities, the slopiness of that line, that really determines the tax inefficiency or not. How much of our total surplus are we going to be losing? Deadweight loss is caused by individuals and firms making inefficient consumption decisions, not choosing to consume the right amount of a good, or by choosing too much of a good, or if we have these regulated markets that cause us to not act like we otherwise would. Right? So if they're having inefficient consumption decisions and it's not where they would have otherwise operated without either this externality or this tax or this subsidy, then that means that there is a loss to the total amount of surplus, right? The inefficiency of any tax is determined by the extent to which consumers and producers change their behavior to avoid the tax. All right, look on the right-hand side, oranges. There are a lot of people who decided to avoid the tax by switching to apples. Yep. That's pretty inefficient right there. Look at the left. All right, gasoline. Not a lot of people switch their buying behavior. Not that inefficient of a tax. Not many people stop buying. Boom. You can now tell about tax inefficiencies. The more elastic is demand, the larger supply. So let's think about, though, what the compounding effect might be. Let's say that we have something like this. It's relatively 45-degree supply and demand line. Cool. We put in a 10-cent tax. Let's say that this is gas. We put in a 10-cent gas tax to gas. All right, so we go from this S1 right here to S2. Well, what happens if we go from S1 to S2? Well, taxes are putting a purposeful inefficiency into a system. Sometimes it's to correct for an externality or pollution or other inefficiency that's already there, but sometimes it's to be able to generate money. So we put in this tax, and what we see is we see a reduction in quantity and we see the price goes up. But this deadweight loss is relatively small, you know, the size of this triangle. Okay, so we say, oh, well, the 10 cents tax, we didn't lose too much surplus. You know what? Let's put in another 10-cent tax. Let's see if we can do it again. And then we move from S2 to S3. But what do we notice when we move from S2 to S3? We go from A to D. This triangle of ADE is much larger than the triangle of ABC, right? This DBCE area, this right here is much larger than that small little triangle. Why is that? Because there's a compounding effect of taxes. If you put a little bit of taxes on something, it's not going to cause much of a deadweight loss. If you keep adding and adding and adding and put a large tax on something, it's going to cause a lot of deadweight loss. This is why it's technically better to tax a whole bunch of goods a little bit and you lose less surplus in the economy and between consumers and producers than taxing just one thing a lot, where you end up losing a lot of surplus. Because taxes have this compounding effect. The more and more you increase them, the larger and larger that section's going to be. Now, tax system efficiencies are also affected by pre-existing distortions. That means if they're already not acting at this equilibrium point. Let's say that this first tax was a pre-existing distortion. Well, then if we want to tax again, we know that this new effect from this new tax is going to be very large because there was already a distortion in the system. Since marginal deadweight loss rises with taxes, the more and more the tax, the larger and larger it is on like an exponential function. Pre-existing distortions can affect the efficiency of any new tax roll. Just so you know what pre-existing distortions are, these are essentially market failures, right? So if we have an externality, if we have imperfect competition, if we have some sort of government intervention such as subsidies, quotas, or taxes, if these already exist, then putting another tax on top of it's going to make it much worse than putting it into a system that did not already have an inefficiency. So this goes back to the same sort of idea, right? Let's say that we have two different types of goods. Maybe we have one that has some sort of externality in it, right? And then maybe one that does not have an externality. Well, let's look at what happens to the deadweight loss. If we have one sort of good that doesn't have an externality, then if we introduce a tax to this clean system that does not already have a disconnect in between social marginal benefit and social marginal cost, and with that cost of externalities, well, then our deadweight loss of this tax is going to be pretty small. But if we have it so that we have a deadweight loss that's already existing because our private marginal cost doesn't match our social marginal cost, say we already have an externality that exists, so we have this externality deadweight loss, well, then introducing a tax is just pushing that supply or demand line even further out, right? And then you get a compounding effect, where though this tax is the same size as this tax on the left, this tax on the left made a little difference. Well, this tax on the right made the GEFH difference of a much larger trapezoid than that little triangle on the left. This is why we need to be careful when we put taxes or subsidies into a system to know what pre-existing distortions might already exist in that marketplace. All right, so let's think about the different types of systems that we have, right? Because last time we talked about progressive, proportional, and regressive tax systems. So let's focus specifically on progressive tax systems to begin with. Remember, these are the ones that get bigger and bigger the more income that there is, right? So that the person at the bottom who makes maybe $20,000 gets little tax, person making $150,000, larger tax, right? Super simple, progressive tax system. So these can actually be less efficient when we start talking about the loss to surplus. And I think that this one's just kind of fun when we get to the graphs. So we're going to talk about it. Why is the deadweight loss larger for the higher wage workers, despite some of the same reductions in hours? So let's think about this. What does this mean? Oops, go forward. There we go. Let's say that we have a low wage worker. Maybe they make $10 an hour. We introduce a new tax. This new tax has shifted the cost of this labor, shifted it upwards, right? So now this same worker needs to make more money to be able to offset this tax. Well, that means that there's going to be much less hours for these low-income workers, right? We've shifted this to a new location. There's less hours worked by these low-income workers, and they do make a slightly higher wage. Notice that we have this deadweight loss created because now there's a bunch of people who no longer have jobs because of the cost of this additional tax. Okay, that's the low wage worker. Let's look at a high wage worker. Well, high wage workers, let's say they get the same percentage or even a larger percentage of a tax. Well, if they get an even larger percentage of a tax, well, then that means, and from this one we're moving to S1 to S3, well, when we put in that same percentage of a tax, notice that both of these are now getting paid slightly more than 10% more. When we put in the same amount of a tax, well, these wages go up by about 10-12% in both of these cases, or I guess 18%. They go up. But what happens, right? Notice that our low wage worker reduced from 1,000 to 894 hours. Our high wage worker went from 1,000 hours to 837 hours. And look at the size of that deadweight loss. That's huge. And that's because sometimes when we put an additional tax, if we do it to a high wage worker, there's actually a lot less hours that they're going to work. And these were higher value hours, which we can show by the price that they were getting paid for their labor. So we're seeing that this is a much larger loss in surplus for the economy relative to the low wage worker. So that's fascinating to think about. What if we don't move it as far? What if we only move it to S2 and we instead give them a slightly slower tax rate? Well, then we see that we've reduced the amount of deadweight loss. Not saying that that's what we should do, right? But just looking at what the deadweight loss is, this is something that we have to consider when we're writing policies and when we're setting tax levels for different income brackets, is thinking about which one is it going to affect and by how much. How much does that surplus is borne by the person consuming those labor services, and how much of that is borne by the person who's supplying their labor services. So there's lots of effects on these reductions. Let's think about another example of deadweight loss. I'm actually going to give you lots of examples of deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss of wireless communications. What are there pre-existing distortions in wireless communications? That's question one. Let's go ahead and think about that. Okay, when I get my cell phone bill, because that's apparently part of adulting, I have to do that now. When I get my cell phone bill, I see that I have one price, and then I get an educator discount, which is kind of cool. But I get this price. And then I notice that there's taxes, right? So I haven't updated my phone number in years. It's still a North Carolina phone number. So I have like North Carolina taxes. I still have local city taxes. I have other taxes like this that represent pre-existing distortions that already exist in the system. Then there's fees. And then there's other things. In a system that tends to already be very price sensitive. If you raise someone's cell phone bill by $25, they are much more likely to go to one of the other major providers, especially because there's always such good deals, right? So the deadweight loss on taxes, the triangle that's created from introducing new taxes on wireless communication, is 53% of revenue. That's so much that's getting lost to the system. And there's a couple reasons for that. People are price sensitive, which means they have elastic demands. They're very willing to walk away if you raise their cell phone bill. They have large pre-existing distortions from imperfect competition because there's so many legal hurdles to start a wireless company that the major 5 or 6 that we have, it's a very interesting arrangement of price competition that they have, but it's not a perfectly competitive market. It's more of an oligopoly, if anything. And there's such high taxes. There's about 25% in some states of your bill that doesn't even go to your wireless network and instead pays telecom taxes to your state and local governments. Which means that there was this pre-existing condition of taxes already in the system, plus extortions or distortions that have already happened from imperfect competition and price sensitivity, right? So that means we have very, very, very large deadweight losses, specifically in wireless communication. Well, if I was going to consider putting a tax on wireless communication, where it looks like people are very willing to walk away and the deadweight loss is high, or I can put instead another 2 or 3 cents tax on gasoline, which people will buy at the same rates anyways, regardless how much tax you put on it. Which one do you do? It's the one where people are more inelastic, right? It's the good in which people are least likely to change their buying patterns relative to a price shift. In this case, it'd be the gasoline and not necessarily wireless communications. This is why putting more taxes on wireless is a bad idea. So with that example, we now see that there might be incentives to put different types of taxes on different things. If I had this very inefficient wireless communication system that I knew already had pre-existing distortions, I might want to put only a little bit of a tax there, because that little bit of a tax might have very large changes in deadweight loss. While for gasoline, which I know is a very inelastic system that has some pre-existing distortions, I would want to put a slightly larger tax on them relative to wireless communication, because I know that their buying patterns are going to be similar. This brings us to the idea of optimal commodity taxation. It's choosing tax rates across goods that minimize deadweight loss. Why do I put a little tax on wireless and a big tax on gasoline? Because it minimizes the deadweight loss when I think to do it that way, because I'm thinking about what does their demand structure look like? Are there pre-existing distortions within the system? We boil this down to something called the Ramsey rule. The Ramsey rule, big fancy, I'm not going to make you work out the math or anything, but it's just the idea that to minimize deadweight loss of a tax system while trying to raise a fixed amount of revenue, taxes should be set across a commodity so that the marginal deadweight loss to marginal revenue raised is equal across commodities. That's just fancy talk for saying if something's very inelastic, tax it a lot. If something's very elastic, tax it a little. Because the deadweight loss that you're going to get is going to be much higher from this one that you're taxing a little bit. But we still want to put it on multiple goods, because if we put a humongous tax on one good, well, that's still going to be a large deadweight loss. So we're still going to want to split the tax on multiple goods, but the amount that we put on each good should be dependent upon how people's price sensitivities look and what already exists within that market. So there's value of additional government revenues, right? So for each dollar that the government raised, we have to ask a very specific question of, is this dollar best in the government's hands and what they use with it? So helping with telecommunication structure, helping finance social redistribution, helping to finance free reduced lunch programs, many of the other things that are used with this tax dollar. Is that extra tax dollar more valuable there, or is the extra tax dollar more valuable in the hands of the private sector, of just being spent on goods and services and working within those markets? That's a tough one to figure out, especially when we try to do cost benefit analysis for individual governments, right? So when we try to do it for the national government, or like even the city of Edwardsville, trying to figure out the value of these additional government revenues and how much it's really taking away from the consumer and producer surplus of private markets. Oh, that's a tough one to do, but it's really worthwhile because it helps us know where taxes should be placed if they are necessary, and it gives us a way to measure if they are necessary. So there's a lot of equity implications that come along with this idea of the Ramsey model, right? Of like tax the inelastic things a lot, tax the more elastic things a little, but still spread the taxes and not just do one thing. Well, optimal taxation kind of balances two specific rules. When we're trying to figure out the best tax system or the best, most efficient tax system, we really want to do one of two things. One, we have the elasticity rule. Lower taxes on things with more elastic demand. You don't put big taxes on oranges because then you'll never sell another orange again. You don't put big taxes on cell phones because people will just go to a different cell phone provider. You instead put it on things that people are very unlikely to change from. So like alcohol, cigarettes, gasoline, so on and so forth. Food, just general food taxes. But should you? And that's a whole other question. We're going to get there in a second. The second part of the optimal taxation that we're balancing, so we have this elasticity rule of kind of how we should, and then we have the broad-based rule, which means it's better to have a wide variety of goods moderately taxed than one good or a few goods heavily taxed. That's the idea of we cannot finance the entire national government just off of gasoline taxes, because then each gallon of gasoline would cost you about $100, right? If not more. That could be devastating. There would be huge deadweight losses if your gas cost you $100 due to the taxes. So maybe it's better to have moderate taxes on lots of things than rather a very, very large tax on one specific inelastic good. But there's still fairness implications, right? Let's imagine we have two goods, cereal, caviar. Okay. The elasticity for caviar is much higher. People are very willing to walk away from caviar if you tax it more. Cereal, on the other hand, fairly inelastic. It's a common staple household item in many different households, but predominantly in low and medium income households. Okay, well, thinking about the Ramsey rule, it would suggest the idea that we should tax this cereal as opposed to the caviar. What this doesn't take into account is the type of households that buy them, though. Cereal is much more likely to be a breakfast staple in low and medium income households, while caviar is much more likely to be something that's bought by people with extremely high incomes who have less of a value to each additional dollar. So should you tax the cereal that hurts more poor families, or should you tax something that you might have a large deadweight loss from, a much larger deadweight loss, but it affects primarily richer citizens? This goes back to the idea of the entire vertical equity argument that we had in the previous section. So that's many of the things that we have to debate when it comes to optimal taxation, because optimal taxation is tricky. If you haven't realized something in the past 20 minutes, you should. It's called taxes are tricky, because finding the exact balance that doesn't harm anyone, but still like incentivizes the programs that people need to the point where they still get more benefit from those programs than those programs not existing, while also trying to keep some sort of vertical equity, while also having other types of fairness, like balancing all these together is a very, very tough job. But we still try to do it. We still try to do it. Do we do it successfully? No, there's a lot of moving pieces, but we try. And we do that by analyzing distortions that already exist in systems. We do that by figuring out what demand and people's willingness to pay actually looks like, or what it actually costs for producers to produce something. And we start to figure out these things for the purpose of creating optimal income taxes or other types of taxes. In this case, I am going to talk about income taxes, though. Let's go back to the stuff that we were studying in class, income taxes. Most taxes in the United States and most developing countries actually come from income taxes. We know that much. But we need the idea of an optimal income tax. So it's choosing the tax rate across different income groups that maximize social welfare, subject to government revenue requirements, right? Let's say that the government needs to raise, I don't know, $10 billion. Do they give a really, really high tax to every single poor family, or do they give a really, really high tax to 3 or 4 rich people? Well, it depends. It depends on what the marginal value of the dollar is. It depends on what the deadweight loss would look like. It depends on if this would affect certain types of product markets from still existing. This depends on many, many, many different things, right? And neither one of those extremes are probably correct. It's probably something in the middle or a combination of lots of these different things. Social welfare functions, looking at this difference in between private marginal benefit and social marginal benefit, as well as private cost and social marginal cost. We look at the trade-offs in between a lot of the progressivity and the efficiency of different systems. And what we don't consider in that is the idea of tax benefit linkages, right? So far we're seeing, okay, deadweight loss occurs from a tax. But what does that tax go to? We never put the money back into the system. We just said, hey, the government took this money and we shifted some lines. What we haven't done is we haven't put the money back in, saying, oh, okay, well, we've taken the money from the consumer side and instead we want to incentivize the producer side, so we're going to give it there. Or let's think about the fact of like someone who is polluting a river. So we have a producer polluting a river. What if we tax that producer because taxes are a purposeful inefficiency that we're putting into the system, but sometimes we do that to try to correct from another inefficiency. Sometimes we have pollution and we want people to operate like the social marginal benefits. So we'll put a tax on it to try to kind of correct for some of that pollution to get them to act more like the social marginal benefit equals social marginal cost place. But don't worry, we'll get back to that in a second. But let's say we take this polluting firm, we tax them, and then instead give the money to the consumers, to the people who are being hurt by the pollution. Well, then society's better off and the producer's kind of worse off. But society still, are they better off? Are they not better off? Well, it depends by which one shifted more. We have to think about these tax benefit linkages. We need to think about the direct ties in between taxes taken out and benefits that are going to be received. So this changes the story a little bit. Let me give you an example. All right, so on the left, we have the effect of only taxes. We put a tax on the consumer. Cool, we know this one. We shift demand inwards. We look at our new equilibrium. We do a nice little dotted line up to the old line. We see a triangle has been formed, and that's a deadweight loss. These are trades that no longer happen once we introduce a tax, right? They're ones that are being lost. It's losses to consumer and producer surplus. Boom. Okay, let's look on the right. Now we have the effect of taxes plus benefits. Step one was we went from the social marginal benefit line. And we went to demand 2. This is the demand line after taxes. At that point, we had gone to part B, or point B. But let's say that we instead give that money to the supplier. Well, when we're subsidizing the supplier, if you go back to that 4 main graphs I showed you at the front, one of them are subsidizing the supplier. When we subsidize the supplier, we shift this outwards, right? Where's that new equilibrium? Well, the new equilibrium in between our taxed consumers and our subsidized suppliers is E. Well, let's draw E up to these main lines. Well, F, G, A. Okay, so these 3 new points that are right above this new equilibrium, if we go to the original lines, well, that's a much smaller triangle, right? When we start thinking about tax benefit linkages, or the benefit that the economic system gets from the subsidies that result from these taxes, the deadweight loss is actually much smaller than the picture we have where just taxes are taken out and nothing's ever given back. So that means that we have to start questioning what happens to the tax. If the money is just lit on fire, then we have the one situation on the left. If the money is instead given back to the community or to one person within this entire system, whether it be the suppliers or the consumers, we have the one on the right, where deadweight loss has decreased. Isn't that so neat? That's just so neat. All right, so there's problems analyzing tax benefit linkages, right? And that is very difficult to measure. I hope you've realized that that's a theme of public economics, is when we're looking at the expenditures and taxation of governments, that things are very, very difficult, and there's lots of moving pieces, and we have to get them all exactly right to know what's going on, and it's very difficult to know all those moving pieces, what all those costs are, what all those benefits are, what the true value of externalities is, what the true value of taxes or subsidies are. It's just, there's so many working parts, even in individual markets, but especially when we start looking at how markets work together. That's kind of the theme of public economics is it's hard, right? But issues raised by some of these tax benefit linkage analyses is, first, why doesn't the private sector provide the benefits? Okay, so maybe they knew that marginal social cost doesn't equal marginal social benefit. So why don't they just have corporate social responsibility and take it out on themselves to clean all the externalities? Well, there might still be market failures, right? They might have it so they don't necessarily want to pay for those benefits because they're still profit maximizing firms, even if some of them are socially responsible and start to clean up their pollution. That doesn't mean all of them will do it, and that doesn't mean all of them will do it to exactly the right amount of pollution for society. Okay, well, what about when there's tax benefit linkages, when we take money from one side and give it to the other side? Well, the tax benefit linkage is strongest when taxes are linked directly to the benefit of that worker, right? So if there is pollution that's caused by one worker and then we put in a benefit by the same amount of a worker, that's great. Awesome. That's something that we can easily measure. And is there evidence of this? Well, sure. We've seen that this has happened in some cases where some financing is borne by workers in the form of there'll be lower wages and lower employment. And that's not necessarily what we want either, right? We're taxing one side to be able to give back to another side. But the way that this happens is instead, we still reduce the quantity, right? And the prices might end up shifting either up or down, and people are still going to be unemployed. That may not necessarily be what you want. Also, there's one thing that I didn't mention on that last slide, but look at the size of these. So we have this really large tax. We have a much smaller benefit. Why aren't the taxes and benefits one-to-one? Well, that's because you have to pay the people who process the taxes, right? The IRS is expensive. For all the taxes that are taken out, you have compliance cost of making sure that all of your paperwork is correct. You have administration costs of hiring all the people who work at the IRS who physically move that money. You have the additional funds that come from having to deal with these deadweight loss, the ramifications of the deadweight loss, or even paying the economists that analyze it. That's money that goes out from the taxes in. So when you get over to the expenditure side, there's much less to give back, right? So, do we have time? We do have time. I'm going to talk about my favorite tax inefficiency for a second. It's actually one of my favorites. I love this. And it's just kind of a very good personification of how sometimes trying to do the right thing when it comes to taxes can fail miserably, right? So this is one of my favorite examples. In 1696, King William III of England needed money to finance a war with France because England and France, they fought a lot back then. Still kind of do today, but they don't do it with tanks. Actually, they didn't do it with tanks back then. Anyways, they had like horseback combat back then. Anyways, doesn't matter. They were trying to finance a war. To raise this money, what he decided to do was he was like, you know what? I need to tax the rich people, but at the time, we don't exactly have W-2s, right? There's no W-2 system in 1696. So how's he going to do it? Rich people have more windows on their home. Okay. We're going to put in a new tax. This new tax is going to be based upon the number of windows on the home, because a house with 3 windows, that's probably a poor home. We're going to tax them a little bit. House with 25 windows, that's probably a rich home. We're going to tax them a lot. What inefficiency just happened with that story? If you were told, hey, you're going to get this massive tax bill for every window that you have on your house, what do? Do you board up some of the windows? Do you rent a house with far less windows? So the problem was people could actively minimize their tax. They knew what their tax bill was, and they knew how to get around their tax bill. The tax bill was equal to the proportion of windows that they had. All they had to do was board up some windows, and they had significantly reduced taxes. Well, this rendered really inefficient measures of taxes. It caused home values to just go loopy, right? And it created a huge deadweight loss. Let me show you what that looks like. So there's actually some researchers who put in on this, and that's why I'm going to get a lot of their information, because these original These original taxes were put in the late 1600s. By the time we got to the mid 1700s, this rule had kind of been around for a while, which means new houses had been built in that 50-year period that were aware of the window tax, right? So when building the houses, people were very, very aware of the tax bill that they would have for each window, which means that they might have decided to have different amount of windows depending on what the tax bill was going to be as they were building their houses. So Oates and Schwab presented a straightforward test for whether this was the case. They looked at whether the number of windows responded to the notches. So there was this tax schedule, right? In between the years 1747 and 1757, there was no tax if your house had fewer than 10 windows. House had fewer than 10 windows, you're obviously a broke person, so no tax for you. Okay, then if you had between 10 and 14 windows, you'd get a tax of 6 pence. That's actually not a lot of money, but in 1947, that was a lot of money. So you get a 6 pence tax if you had in between 10 and 14 windows. Then let's say that you were balling. You had between 15 and 19 windows. If you had between 15 and 19 windows, you got taxed 9 pence. And then let's say you're McMansioning, you have over 20 windows, you got a whole shilling as your tax. Well, okay, if you needed to make a decision on how many windows you're going to put in on your house, let's think about that. Well, if you have fewer than 10, you don't get taxed. So there's a big incentive to have only 9 windows, right? It's as many windows as you can have without getting taxed. Okay, then 10 to 14. So I could have 14 windows and at that point get 6 pences. But if I add a 15th window, it goes up to 9 pences. You raise my taxes by 50% for one window? No. I have an incentive to stay at 14 windows. Again, at 19 windows, right? If you can stay at 9 pence instead of 1 shilling, you might want to do that. So you might stay at 19 windows. So there are these notches that are created where people see the different tax cutoffs. This is why there's certain people out there who realize that their income taxes go up at certain levels. So once you get to about that income level, they'll say, no, please don't pay me anymore, because you might either lose the government assistance program, which we do see happens, but not nearly as much as people say it does. It's actually a small percentage of people who choose not to work because they might lose assistance programs. There's also people who make lots and lots of money who are right on the cusp of those very highest tax brackets who might decide to not work because of those same reasons as well. So let's think about marginal tax rates and windows. All right, so here they went and they looked at the homes and then they counted how many windows were on all the homes in the 1700s. What did we see? All right, so you got a big tax starting at 10 windows. Wow, there were a lot of homes with 9 windows. All right, then there's another tax of 15 windows. Wow, there's a lot of homes with 14 windows. And again at 19. This is one of the most beautiful examples of tax inefficiencies that exist because we can actually see in the data. You can literally go look at these houses now. This is why in all of like England, you still have houses without windows years later, right? Years later. It's because of this window tax and the fact that people were purposely making decisions when they built their houses on how many windows they would have relative to taxes. We can see in real time that people made decisions based upon this. And I just think that that is nifty. All right, so one person could argue that there was some British custom or some other reason for having 9 or 14 or 19 windows. Maybe they were lucky numbers. So they instead looked at when the government shifted again in 1961. In 1961, the government added a provision because they were realizing that a lot of people were deciding to have a lot of people had 9 windows, right? So they put in a new one that if you had houses with 8 or 9 windows, you actually had to pay a shilling per window. Notice that inflation had happened and windows were worth more money. Anyways, that means that after 1761, there was suddenly an incentive to no longer stay at that 9 window amount, right? Because you were about to pay a lot in taxes if you stayed at that 9 window amount. You had an incentive to go to 7 windows. Notice there's not many things at 7 windows. What did we see? Look at that. Look at that. The majority of homes bricked up their windows to stay at 6 windows to avoid taxes at that point. And that is just tax aversion, or well, tax avoidance. So tax avoidance there's two different types, right? There's tax avoidance, tax evasion. Tax avoidance, totally legal, right? That's the idea of like, I'm changing the number of windows on my house, or maybe I'm deciding to cover my pool, or maybe I'm doing other sorts of things. Tax evasion is the illegal one, right? That's when you start like lying on your taxes and you're evading taxes by just not paying them or doing scandalous things. Tax avoidance is finding a loophole and driving a truck through it. Not illegal. Evasion, totally illegal. Tax avoidance happens in practice all the time, whether it's back in the 1700s when people have manipulated their windows, or today when people take advantage of every tax credit they have available to them, right? So Keynes, in the words of Keynes, said the avoidance of taxes is the only pursuit that still carries any reward. Not evasion, I'm not saying lie on your taxes, but the pursuit of avoidance of taxes, looking at what tax credits apply to you, looking at what tax deductions apply to you. This still has a reward in Keynes's eyes anyways, who, if you don't know John Maynard Keynes, get me started on that one, because I have a huge thing about the Keynes versus Hayek arguments of you know, the Great Recession. Okay, or not the Great Recession, the Great Depression. Let's bring it back. Let's think about a couple other ideas of tax avoidance. The Papal States. So back in Tuscany, there used to be a tax on salt, and the tax on salt was so large that Tuscan bakers just took all salt out of their bread, which is why Tuscan breads are very, very saltless and often don't rise to the same amount. And that's because there was a heavy tax on salt for decades, and they adjusted an entire country's baking history, or entire people's baking history, based upon it. Here's another one. In the 1980s, Cyprus, they taxed buildings, but only finished structures, right? So lots of homeowners would just keep some metal bars jutting out of their roofs. They would just not finish one corner of their house, because then they had a beautiful house, wonderful house, except for that one corner. We don't look over there, but beautiful house. But it wasn't technically a finished structure, so it was not taxed as such. Thailand, they tax business signs that are outside of the business, and there's so you can have your business down the street and you can have a sign outside your business, but there's a higher tax on English only signs. So in tourism districts today, if you go to Thailand, you'll see that there's English related signs, especially in tourist areas, but always in the corner there's a little bit of Thai writing, right? Or the signs just right inside the door of the building. And that's because it ends up avoiding taxes. Tax avoidance is totally legal. It's making these sorts of purposeful decisions to avoid a tax. Tax evasion, not legal. Don't do that. All right, I hope y'all enjoyed that, because those are just some of my favorite examples of tax avoidance. I will see you in class. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.